There's a moment in everyone's life when they realize something is wrong. You work 40 hours a week. You budget carefully. You avoid unnecessary spending. And somehow, you're still broke. The rent increases faster than your salary. Food costs more every year. Healthcare is unaffordable. Education requires decades of debt. And retirement feels like a fantasy reserved for people who inherited wealth. You're not failing. You're experiencing exactly what the system was designed to do. Because in 1913, a group of bankers met in secret on Jekyll Island, Georgia, and designed a mechanism that guarantees you will work your entire life, pay interest on money that didn't exist until you borrowed it, and transfer wealth upward to people who produce nothing. This isn't conspiracy. This is the documented structure of the Federal Reserve System, fractional reserve banking, and perpetual debt expansion. And once you see how it works, you'll understand why financial freedom isn't a goal you haven't reached yet. It's a destination the system mathematically prevents you from arriving at. Let me show you exactly how they built it, why it requires your perpetual debt to function, and why every dollar you earn is designed to flow upward while you tread water forever. Before 1913, banks operated differently, but in November 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich and 6 of America's most powerful bankers traveled in secret to Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. J.P. Morgan's representatives, Rockefeller's representatives, and bankers from Kuhn, Loeb and Company. They spent 9 days designing what would become the Federal Reserve System. In 1913, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act. President Wilson signed it, and the system went live in 1914. Here's how it works. The Federal Reserve is a hybrid institution, part government, part private banking consortium. The Board of Governors is appointed by the President, but the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks are owned by private member banks. When the government needs money, it doesn't print currency, it issues treasury bonds. The Federal Reserve buys those bonds, crediting the government's account with new money. That money didn't exist before, it's created digitally, backed by nothing except the government's promise to repay with interest. But here's the critical detail. The interest on that debt exceeds the money created. If the government borrows $100 billion at 5% interest, it owes $105 billion. But only $100 billion was created. The extra $5 billion doesn't exist in the money supply yet. So where does it come from? From economic growth, from more borrowing that creates more money from you through taxes and inflation. It's a system that requires perpetual expansion. And it's working exactly as designed. But the Federal Reserve is just the top layer. The real mechanism is how banks create money through lending. Here's how it works in practice. You deposit $1,000 in your bank. Traditionally, banks held a fraction in reserve and lent the rest. But here's what most people don't know. Since March 2020, US banks have no reserve requirements, zero. They're now limited by capital requirements and lending standards, not reserves. But the core mechanism remains. When a bank makes a loan, it doesn't lend out depositor money. It creates new money by crediting the borrower's account. You borrow $100,000 for a house. The bank types $100,000 into your account. That money didn't exist before. The bank created it, and you owe it back with interest. This is how most money enters the economy, not from the Federal Reserve, from commercial banks making loans. In 2024, of the roughly $21 trillion in M2 money supply, approximately $17 trillion exists because of bank lending. Money created from debt. And every dollar of that debt charges interest. This is why housing costs exploded. In 1970, the median home price was $23,400. The median household income was $9,870. A home cost 2.4 times annual income. By 2024, the median home price was $420,000. Median income was $75,000. A home costs 5.6 times annual income. Did houses get better? No. Did wages stagnate? Yes. But the real driver is money creation through mortgage lending. Banks created trillions in mortgage debt. That new money flooded into housing, driving prices up. And now you need a 30-year mortgage, paying nearly the home's value again in interest over the loan term to afford what your grandparents bought with 3 years of income. The system isn't broken, it's functioning perfectly. You're supposed to be in debt, because your debt is how money is created, and the interest you pay is their profit. Now here's where it becomes inescapable. Inflation is not a natural phenomenon, it's a policy choice. The Federal Reserve targets 2% inflation annually. That means your money loses half its value every 35 years. If you save $100,000 today, in 35 years it will buy what $50,000 buys now. Your savings are designed to decay. But here's what they don't tell you. Inflation isn't evenly distributed. When new money enters the economy, it enters through specific channels. Banks get access first through cheap credit from the Fed. Large corporations get it through bond markets and government contracts. Asset holders get it through rising valuations. By the time it reaches your paycheck through wage increases, prices have already risen. You're always chasing purchasing power you'll never catch. This is called the Cantillon effect, named after 18th century economist Richard Cantillon. And it's why wealth inequality isn't an accident. It's a structural feature. The closer you are to money creation, the more you benefit. The farther away, the more you lose. Wages are always the last to rise because workers have the least leverage to demand increases until inflation has already eroded their purchasing power. By design, you lose. Every year, 2% at a time, compounding. But even if you understand this, even if you try to escape, the system has countermeasures. Let's say you avoid debt, you save aggressively, you invest wisely. Congratulations, you're trying to opt out. But here's the trap. To save, you need to hold your wealth somewhere. Cash loses value to inflation at 2% annually. Stocks are volatile and dominated by institutional investors with better information and faster execution. Real estate requires property taxes, maintenance, insurance, and is subject to market crashes and zoning restrictions. Gold is taxed as a collectible at 28% long-term capital gains, higher than stocks. Cryptocurrency is monitored, regulated, and faces ongoing legislative pressure. Every escape route has a cost, and those costs accumulate. You can minimize your losses, but you cannot escape the structure because the structure is the entire economy. You need dollars to pay taxes. You need banks to receive your paycheck, pay bills, access credit. You need compliance with regulations, licenses, insurance, all of which cost money and time. The system doesn't need to catch you. It just needs to make every alternative more expensive than participation. And it does. Here's the end game. In the 1950s and 1960s, the average American household saved 8 to 10% of income. By the early 2000s, that rate approached zero, even going negative during the mid-2000s housing boom. As of 2024, the personal savings rate fluctuates between 3 and 5%. Well below historical norms. People are saving less, consuming more, and financing the gap with credit. Total US household debt is $17.9 trillion as of late 2024. That debt generates approximately $1.2 to $1.5 trillion in annual interest payments flowing from households to financial institutions. And it's growing because wages haven't kept pace with costs. In 1980, a single income could support a family, buy a home, and save for retirement. By 2024, dual incomes barely cover rent, childcare, and groceries in many cities. The system requires expanding debt because debt is how money is created in our fractional reserve banking system. And the interest on that debt is what extracts wealth. You're not failing to save. You're successfully participating in a system designed to keep you borrowing. Because the moment borrowing contracts significantly, the money supply shrinks, spending falls, and the economy contracts. Your debt isn't your failure, it's your function in the system. Let me show you why this can't be easily fixed. Most of the money in circulation, roughly 80 to 85% of broad money supply, exists because of bank lending. If everyone paid off their debts simultaneously, that money would be destroyed. The money supply would collapse. Commerce would halt. The economy would enter a severe contraction. So the system requires perpetual debt expansion. More loans, more credit, more money creation, which means more inflation, more wealth flowing to those closest to money creation, more inequality. You cannot fix a system whose function is the problem. The Federal Reserve can't stop expanding money because government spending exceeds tax revenue by 1.7 to 1.9 trillion annually, requiring constant bond purchases. Banks can't stop lending because their business model depends on loan volume and interest income. You can't stop borrowing because asset prices, inflated by decades of credit expansion, require debt to access. It's a closed loop. Every participant is trapped by the structure. And the people who benefit most are those closest to money creation, the banks that create money through lending, the government that spends beyond its revenue, the asset holders who bought before inflation made prices unaffordable. Everyone else is working to service the system. Your labour, your time, your debt payments are the fuel that keeps the machine running. This is the system designed at Jekyll Island in 1910 and implemented in 1914. Perpetual debt expansion, systematic inflation, and wealth extraction disguised as economic growth. The Federal Reserve manages the money supply. Banks create money through lending. Inflation erodes your savings. Asset prices rise faster than wages. And your primary option is to borrow at interest to participate in major purchases. You can work harder, you can budget better, you can invest smarter, but you cannot escape the mathematics. Because the system isn't designed primarily for your prosperity. It's designed for stability through perpetual expansion. And expansion requires debt. It requires interest payments. It requires you to work, to borrow, to service obligations on money that was created the moment you signed the loan. The bankers who met in secret understood this. They built a system that would endure, and 111 years later, it's functioning as intended. You're not struggling because you're bad with money. You're struggling because the money system itself requires your participation through debt. And there is no easy exit, just the persistent challenge of building wealth in a system where the currency itself is designed to lose value, where wages lag asset prices, where debt is the primary wealth building tool for most people. That's not a game with simple solutions. That's a system optimized for expansion and stability at the macro level, with individual prosperity as a secondary concern. And understanding that is the first step to navigating it, even if you cannot escape it entirely.